We are live. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm seeing some people trickle in. Hello, hello. Welcome to workshop number 5. We're just going to wait a couple minutes before we get started to allow people to join. Let's see here. For everyone logging on right now, is this your first session or have you been here before? This is workshop number 5. Hello, Christopher York. Lovely to see you. Or see your name. I can't actually see you. Larissa, first session. Wow, been here before. Number 5. Is it, oh God, is it Dia? James? It's your first session? Did I say that right? Dia? I'm sorry. I'm really bad with pronunciations. Oh, I was right. Wonderful. Gary and Gail, 4th time, welcome. Oh, how do you spell or say your name? I should stop asking how to do this because I screw it up every time. Joe, I'm not even gonna try and say your last name. Welcome, Joe. Welcome, Joe from JDL Ventures. No, I'm not gonna try. We'll just wait for a couple more minutes. 1 or 2 or so. If you were here last week, did anyone implement anything that Marcel talked about? Not everyone at once. Oh, now there's 2 of Marcel. I think his screen froze.
I'm back.
Sorry, my Zoom decided to.
Hey, it happens.
Yeah.
There you go. Now we don't have to see 2 of you. Just 1 of you is good. Cody priced out a new project with it. Awesome, Cody. I love that.
I hope you are very profitable on that project, Cody.
Okay. It is 6 minutes after 11, so let's kick this off. Welcome everyone to workshop number 5. We're going to talk about how savvy agencies set themselves up to scale. So thank you for joining us. Why do I always do that with my slides? Our agenda, we're going to define the right strategy, designing the right system, setting it all up, and then maintaining it overall. We have Marcel from Parakeeto. Oh, what did I do? My screen? Can everyone still see my screen? Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. Marcel is the CEO and co-founder of Parakeeto. It's a company dedicated to helping agencies measure and improve their profitability by streamlining their operations and reporting systems. He's also the fractional COO at Goldfront. It's an award-winning creative agency out in San Francisco, one of my favorite places. And he's been working with brands like Uber, Slack, Keep, as well as the head strategic coach at SaaS Academy by Dan Martell. And it's the #1 coaching platform for B2B SaaS businesses in the world. My name is Colleen Mcgrath. I'm the Senior Manager of Community here at Vendasta, and I am so excited to be your host along with Fish. Without further ado, I'm just going to showcase that this is part of our Conquer Local workshop series. So we have our podcast, academy, and community. Everything that you see today will be recorded and shared inside of our community in our community group. Fish is actually going to be sharing a link right now. There you did. So be sure to check it out. I won't keep rambling because Marcel has the good stuff. So Marcel, I'll stop sharing. Take it away.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to part 5 of this 6-part series. Man, it's been a heck of a ride so far, has it not? I saw some folks in the chat that have already started applying some of the learnings. Give me a fire emoji in the chat if this is not your first session, if you have been riding along so far. If you haven't been on the first 4 sessions, we covered a lot of ground. There are a lot of things that you might hear today you're not quite sure exactly what they mean, thank you, Michael. Thank you, Rini. Nice to have you both back. So if you're not familiar with some of the stuff that you hear today, know that there are 4 very dense sessions that we've already done so far in partnership with Vendasta. They are all available in the Conquer Local community, which Vish is linked up. So if you want to get access to those replays, just make sure you go register there. You'll be able to see all the previous sessions that we've done. And there's also a nice little group in there where you can ask me questions. And I pop in there a couple times a week to see what people are asking and give my best answers. And hopefully I've been doing a good enough job on that, but I'm going to wait for Colleen to give me a performance evaluation on these things later on in this process. Man, lots of fire emojis in the chat. Thank you, Renee, Thomas, Carla, Cody, Edwin. Nice to have you all back. So today's session is all about tooling. We've had conversations so far about key metrics. We've had conversations about pricing and scoping and how to measure things. But what I want to talk about today is all of the questions that come after this. We've talked about some strategy, but now we have to talk a little bit of implementation. And the question that I get all the time is, Marcel, what tools should I use? How should I set them up, et cetera, et cetera? What's the best time tracking tool, the best project management tool? And the answer to that question is the ones that you will use. That's really the answer to that question. There isn't necessarily a best tool for this, that, and the other thing. And the fundamental problem that I see lots of agencies running into is they run to tools to try and solve this reporting and measurement problem without ever addressing the strategy behind the tools. And so I want to ask you a question. If we don't have clarity on what the tool is supposed to give us in terms of data, then are we in a good position to evaluate if that tool is right for us or not? The answer, of course, is no. It'd be like if we went to, I don't know, any drive-through restaurant and just said to the person, I'm hungry. They're not really equipped to provide you with an order for food unless you tell them what your requirements are. I'm a vegetarian. I need some fries with that. I need a sweet and sour sauce, and I'm extremely hungry and I need to upsize my meal, right? This is a really terrible analogy, but you get the basic premise. So many of us run to a time tracking tool, a project management tool, an all-in-one tool, expecting it to solve our problems, but we haven't done the work ourselves to get clear on what is the data that we need to get out of this to support conversations and questions inside of our organization. So we're going to talk about the high-level strategies that will get you a lot of progress towards actually being able to evaluate your current tooling and get more out of it, or figure out if you need to switch and do a better job of picking the right thing going forward. So with that, we are going to transition straight into some slides here. And before we get into the content, I just want to recap a couple of quick things for those of you that are new here and joining us on the profitability train for the first time. So as a reminder, I'm Marcel Petitpas. I own 3 of these shirts. I am the CEO and co-founder of Parakeeto, where we help agencies measure and improve their profitability through a combination of proprietary tech and consulting. As Colleen mentioned, I am the fractional COO at Goldfront, get to work with lots of cool clients. I'm also the host of a very amazing podcast, at least I think it's very amazing, called the Agency Profit Podcast. So make sure you go subscribe to that if you want to nerd out on agency profitability with some of the top experts in the world on that space. And I'm very fortunate to get to spend a lot of my time just doing this, hanging out with other agency operations nerds and talking about this subject that I love way too much. Honestly, it's a little bit strange how much I'm into this. And yeah, this is what we do. We help agencies measure and improve their profitability. We're the only firm that I know of that only focuses on this. We're not an accounting firm that happens to claim to do this on the side. We're not a software company that claims to help you with profitability. Our entire firm, everything we do is meant to, in an unbiased way, help you do this regardless of what kind of tools, processes, pricing, strategy, services you offer. That's it. All right. So we've talked a little bit about this, but if you're here, it probably means that you're struggling with having a clear vision and strategy for how to measure performance in your agency. We've covered that in the first 4 trainings, so definitely go back and check those out. You might be struggling with messy data and systems. We're going to talk a lot about that today. And then in the last session, we're really going to address the guessing and stressing problem and really show you how to pull all the pieces that we've talked about in the first 4 sessions together to do forecasting. So you can actually start to get ahead of the things that are happening in your business, as opposed to feeling like your business is happening to you all the time, which is really the curse of running a service business. It's very, very hard to get out of that position. And so my promise to you is we're going to take some of the clear metrics and benchmarks that we've talked about today. We're going to talk in today's session really about the frameworks for how to properly set up your systems and tools. And then in the next session, we will get into how to put all that together to see into the future. So without further ado, to recap, we've covered core financial metrics in our first session. We covered earning efficiency and utilization. We also spent a little bit of time in our last session talking about scoping from the perspective of how to properly price projects. And today we're going to finish off scoping accuracy by talking about how to implement the tools that will make it very easy to measure what actually happened and make sure that that is not a cumbersome or very expensive process to go through. So with that, we're going to come back to the agency profitability flywheel and just kind of recap this. In the previous session, we touched a little bit on the flywheel and about how a really key feedback loop here is estimates versus actuals, time and cost tracking. If we can get those things to line up, then it makes it so much easier to get this insight. And so what we're going to spend a little bit of time on here is how to actually achieve that outcome in practice, right? So let's talk about that for a moment. The goal here is to make sure that when we pull our time tracking data, that it doesn't end up looking like this. And I know I asked this question in the last session, but I'll ask it again. Have you ever pulled timesheets at the end of a project to be like, okay, how much time did this take us versus what we kind of estimated? You hold up your estimate and it says one set of things like, you know, estimating this many design hours, this many development hours, this many copywriting hours, et cetera. And then you pull your timesheets and there's time tracked against like 200 random tasks that none of them are named the same thing as what was on the estimate. Anybody ever had that predicament? Give me a yes in the chat, an emoji, something, an acknowledgement that you are alive and breathing. Chris, always. Yes, it's a painful thing if we don't have this sorted out. Yes, says Carla. Yes, we've all had this experience at some time or another. And now this question that is very simple. Thank you, Cody. Cody's also had this challenge. This question that should be very simple of how much time did it take relative to what we thought is now very, very difficult to answer because we have to take those time entries and clean them, transform them, align them to the right data schema for how our estimate is set up. And we might not even have the information that we need to do this. It might not even be possible because we didn't set up our time tracking tool in the right way. And so we either can get that insight, but behind a lot of work, which none of us have the time to do because we're busy agency owners and we don't have all afternoon to poke around in a spreadsheet to answer a single question, or we just can't get the insight. And now we just continue to make guesses about scope and price and what did or didn't go wrong on a project. And so what I'm proposing here is that we want to try and create perfect alignment between how our estimates are structured and how our time tracking data is structured, such that when we pull a timesheet, it can immediately answer the question of, did we spend as much time on this as we thought? And ideally be able to do that at the different levels of granularity that are necessary to give us the right directional insight. And so this is the outcome over here that we're looking for is, you know, a client. We know exactly what that maps to in the time tracking tool. We know exactly what a project maps to. We know exactly what, you know, role 1, role 2, role 3 maps to. And there's lots of different ways to do this. We're not going to necessarily talk about nuts and bolts. We might use tags. We might use groups. We might use some other object in our time tracking or project management tool to create this alignment. But the alignment is the objective at the end. Will you be covering how you do estimates? Do you have a developer do it per line or use passive similar work? Cody, last session should talk a little bit about this, but I will talk about some linear algebra models today. I'll recap that a little bit, but the last session was all about scoping and pricing. So that is definitely a good one to refer to. And then we'll talk a little bit today about some of this as well. So the Incident Investigator, this is an exercise that you can all go through to kind of start wrapping your head around how this should be structured. And the thought process that I want to encourage you to go through here is really sitting back and thinking about like, okay, if we had a project that I found out was a complete dumpster fire, it just went totally off the rails, what is the series of questions that I would ask to try and figure out what was going on, right? What went wrong? And so the first question that I might ask, of course, is, you know, like, what service line, for example, did this kind of gap start to emerge from? And sorry, I just have the wrong reference files up here. So give me a moment. There we go. So like, did we go over budget? Might be the first question. And then the second question we might go is like, where did we go over budget? And then the next question that we might ask is like, what project, for example, like what project or client, what project? Right. So if we figure out like, hey, something's off, we look at our financials, we're like, man, our profitability is not very good, or there's something going on. Like, how would we go through auditing that? What is the series of questions that we would ask to try and triangulate what's going on? And then what's the metric that we could use? So of course, this would be, for example, budget versus actuals by client or project. Actually, that would be this one here. And then where do we go over budget? This might be budget versus actuals by, in my case, it would be by role, because that's how we estimate, right? So we're estimating like how many consultant hours, how many data analyst hours do we need to get this project done? So I would be thinking about this by role. So what would that be for you? What is the kind of first key category? And then what happened that caused this to go over budget, right? The metric here might be time spent by task as an example. Or if I look a level deeper, I might see, oh shit, we spent 36 hours doing wireframe version 1. It usually takes us half as much time. So what happened there? And really what this is meant to do is give you a sense of like, okay, how would I structure my data so I could start running through these questions and starting to get a sense of where I need to have conversations, where I need to focus my energy, where my team needs to focus their energy. So there's an example here underneath that I'll kind of go through that's much more specific. So as an example, like what clients or projects are healthy. What clients or projects are or aren't healthy. The next one might be which projects or where in the projects did we go over budget? Right, what department was poorly scoped? And what task was the culprit? So this is an exercise that all of you can kind of sit down and go through as well and just kind of think through, if I looked at my high level financials and saw we have a profitability problem, how would I start to investigate that? What's kind of the first, second, third, fourth question? That starts to get you a sense of priority. And then you can start to think about what objects in my time tracking tool could I use to map to this? And at the end, what we really should end up with is some kind of a structure that looks like this, right? So what is the structure of my estimate? Right? How am I kind of structuring the assumptions inside of my organization? And then what is the structure of my time tracking data? And then creating this kind of perfect alignment between the two of them. Now, there's something that I want to call out here that's very, very important. And this is kind of managing complexity. There's this idea that precision equals accuracy. Right? So of course, if I can be more precise, if I can be more detailed, if I can know exactly how much time was spent on a subtask within a task, within a deliverable, within a milestone, within a project, within a phase, right? Like, then of course, having that more like precise data is going to help me be more accurate. But the reality is that that is not the case. In fact, a lot of times the opposite is true. Trying to be more precise actually comes at the cost of accuracy because it becomes substantially more expensive to get your team to track time at that level. You'll see compliance go down with every layer of complexity that you add to the time tracking schema. You'll also start to have more inconsistent data. You'll have smaller buckets of data, which makes it harder to see patterns or increases the amount of data required to start to see these patterns. And so often we over-index on precision, especially at the point where we've reached a point of diminishing returns. Being 5% more precise adds 0% additional accuracy to the high level insight that we're trying to get. So keep in mind that as we try to increase the level of precision, the cost and complexity of this system goes up exponentially. So what I would encourage all of you to do is, as you go in and start to decide on, okay, how are we actually going to set up our time tracking tool here, and what are the pieces of information that we need on every single time entry so we can map back to the estimate, that you start with the simplest viable solution. Maybe it's just we're tracking client, we're tracking project, and then within that project, we're tracking how much time went to these 4 kind of key buckets that are defined by roles, as an example, right? How much project management, design, et cetera, time. And maybe for the starting point, you don't start to break this down by phase or by milestone or by deliverable. You just keep it to those 3 levels. Start there and get the team on board with that process. Make sure you can do it. Make sure the compliance is good. And you might find 2 things. Number one, you don't often need the additional information because you can get a lot of the insight just from having a conversation with the team. If you know that it's like, okay, well, this project went over specifically on project management, you can just go have a conversation with the project management team and say, hey, what happened here? What did we miss? What happened that we didn't expect? And get the answer without actually needing to carry the burden and the cost of tracking now all of the tasks or all of the specific time that went across each task. You don't have to carry that complexity around with you all the time in order to get the insight. So oftentimes we way over index on precision, and we try to add a lot of complexity to this initially because we think like, well, I should track everything, or I want to track everything, without acknowledging that tracking everything is kind of a recipe for disaster as it relates to change management, compliance, et cetera. So I'm encouraging everyone to keep it simple, which is keep it simple, stupid to start. Okay. That's the key to getting started with time tracking compliance and restructuring your data schema. Less complexity is better to start until you know that you can kind of manage that complexity going forward. And then you can be very deliberate about where you go deeper. So over time, if you have this structure really well defined, this is what it could start to look like. So let's imagine that we've defined our data schema as the following. We are going to be tracking the client, of course, the project, and then the role within that project. So this is how our time is going to be grouped. And sorry, my handwriting is really atrocious today, worse than usual. So I'm going to rewrite these so that they're somewhat legible. So this is how we're going to structure our time tracking, right? We have the client, we have the project, and we have the role. And with project, we're also going to have a type tag, right? So we have 4 different types of projects, for example. We do websites, we do funnels, we do SEO, and we do some other thing. So if we have that information and we keep it, this is a very simple data schema, 3 levels of complexity. Then what we can start to do is ask the question of, okay, let's imagine for a moment that I want to know how much design time on websites is required for every $1 of budget that the client adds to the website budget. Well, now if I can figure out what is the budget that's required from the client, or what is the, whatever we want to use to measure complexity, I can figure that out. And essentially I can triangulate very, very quickly, because I have historical data on this and it's the same across all my website projects, roughly how much design it's going to take to get this done. Because every project that I start tracking time against, I will have some kind of an understanding of how much time was required for this particular subsection versus the budget that was allocated. And this allows me to create this relationship line. And this is formally referred to as, the technical term for this is reference class forecasting. It's the idea of doing forecasting based on a set of reference data, historical data of what has happened in the past, therefore what will happen in the future. And the key here is understanding what are the reference classes. And in this case, the reference class is design time on website projects. So we build this correlation between, for every dollar of budget that we add, or every additional web page, or whatever we want to use for our complexity metric, how much additional time does this require? We build a relationship line, and then all we have to do is have a formulaic way to, in the sales process, figure out the complexity. That allows us to triangulate the amount of design time. And then what we can also start to do is use process to start really pushing the distribution of those data points closer to the middle line. And with very little data, you'd be surprised at how little data it requires. 5, 6, 7 projects, and you have a very reliable relationship line, especially if the distribution is not that wide. And of course, the more data you get on this graph, and then the more process you put in place to start normalizing the distribution, the more and more reliable this relationship line gets. And that's how we get to a place where we're doing far more precise estimation, substantially more, and there's science on this, substantially more accurate estimation versus doing bottom-up guesswork of, I think it's going to take an hour for this task and 2 hours for this task. That takes so much longer, and it is substantially less accurate. And now we have a faster, more accurate way to measure projects that requires almost no context or expertise. We can enable a salesperson with 3 to 5 questions that they ask the client. Based on the answers to those questions, they can quantify 1 to 5, right? What is the answer that the client gave me? And instantly get this information for each role that's required on a project. This is intelligent estimation using reference class forecasting. So big idea, but really simple from the perspective of all we need to do in order to achieve this kind of a data structure and be able to do this kind of stuff is just clearly define and normalize our data schema across all of our projects. So really defining for every single project, we always need to make sure that the client is clearly defined, that it has a clearly defined project type, and that we normalize, 3, 4, 5, 6 roles or tasks or departments or whatever we want to call them, and make sure that this is consistent across all of our different work, and that our time tracking tool is set up to measure this using whatever objects we choose to use that work for us. Once we have that information, then what we can start to do is fill in the gaps on detail using reporting and feedback and process optimization. So what this looks like in practice is at the end of a project, or if we run mostly recurring projects, we can have these monthly or bi-weekly standing meetings where we come in, we run a report, and we get a sense of what was the estimate versus the actual. And then we can start to ask the questions of, what happened? Why did it happen? What can we learn from this? And that's going to start to inform process improvements, either to the way we estimate or to the way that we run the project. And this is often what's going to close the gap. And I think this is why we index so much to precision, is we forget that the data will never tell us why the data is. It can only ever tell us what the data is. And so we tend to forget that and think, okay, well, I need to know exactly how much time it took for every single task on this project if I'm going to figure out what happened. But the reality is, a conversation with our team is a far less expensive and usually a far richer way to get to the answer. Even if we knew exactly how much time it took on the task, we would not know why unless we actually had context from a human being. So I would encourage you all in the early days to rely far less on precise data and far more on conversations with your team to really get to the end result, which is insight about how you can improve the efficiency of the business, whether that be through better estimation practices or more deliberate delivery practices. And again, we may have covered this on the last call, but making sure that as you go through this process improvement process, that you prioritize things using an ICE scoring system so that you're pushing the things to the top that have the highest impact, confidence, and the lowest amount of effort. So we use this formula. We rank everything usually from 1 to 5 on how much impact we think it's going to have, what our confidence level that impact is going to be achieved, and we divide it by the amount of effort it's going to take. And this should allow us to take all the different ideas that surface out of these conversations and work on the ones that are most likely to move the needle. So that is the high level on core financials, earning efficiency, utilization, and scoping accuracy. I'm sure that there are some questions on this, so we're going to spend some time on that. But before we do, I just want to remind everyone that our last session coming up next week is when we're going to pull all of this stuff together and really talk about how we can see into the future by using the building blocks we've talked about over the first 5 sessions. So this was a really big one. Oh, the last thing is fill out the survey. There's going to be a survey somewhere, somehow. I'm sure Vish is taking care of that, because you're always taking care of stuff, Vish, you snappy guy. You always look so good while you do it too. So wherever the survey ends up, please fill it out. We appreciate your feedback. We want to make these sessions as valuable as possible. And of course, if you want some free resources to help you implement everything that I've been teaching in these sessions, head to parakeeto.com/toolkit. And I've got a whole bunch of free stuff for you there that should enable you to get all of these basics in place and walk you through some of the processes that we've talked about today. So with that, we're going to open it up for Q&A, because I'm sure that there are some big questions here that need to be answered around what I just talked about, because it's a pretty nebulous topic. All right, who's up?
Okay, so Cody had asked a question, and the first one said, will you be covering how to do estimates? And you kind of answered that. Then he provided some clarity. He was in the last session, but he meant more on who generates these tasks that eventually get lined up, estimate versus actual. We struggle with having seniors doing quotes, but then trying to convert a senior's estimate into how long it would take a junior to do. Example, multiplying senior estimates by 1.4. He will wait until the end. It is the end.
Yeah, it is the end. So this is a good question. So Cody, it sounds like right now, what you're essentially doing is just having people do bottom-up estimation. And depending on what kind of services you sell, if there isn't any consistency or standardization to those services, then you may have to continue to do that for some time. And so what you're talking about right now is essentially some form of contingency. So while you may not be able to, because assuming that there isn't a substantial amount of consistency of the type of work that you do, you can't necessarily build data models around how much time it takes per role, per whatever, for this particular type of work. However, I would argue that if you keep the levels broad enough, you can probably still create really helpful models around type of work and start to understand the correlation between budget and effort, and hopefully start getting away from bottom-up estimation. The other thing that you can do, though, related to what you're asking for here, is start to understand and build linear algebra around what is the correlation between having a junior person do this kind of work and the additional amount of time that it takes. So you could literally, again, if you have some level of standardization here, literally start to compare, okay, like over the last 10 websites that we've built, when a senior did this deliverable or worked on this phase, it took them X amount of time. And when a junior or intermediate person worked on that same phase, it took them Y amount of time. The average multiplier is 30%. It takes junior people 30% longer. You can build real data around that and essentially start to build formulas for your contingency that you apply to these estimates. But the long and short here is, if you're doing very bespoke work and every project looks wildly different, then you may have to continue to do bottom-up estimation. And I think really the question here, the important thing for you to do is going to be really standardizing the format for that estimate, so you don't have the final form of that estimate being per task. You might get to your data schema by working bottom up. So an example of that is like you have task 1, you have task 2, you have task 3. Each of these should essentially be tagged with some kind of a task category, right? So like this is a design task. This is a design task. This is a development task, right? Because what we don't want to end up with is an estimate that's made up of 500 tasks. That's going to be a nightmare in your time tracking tool. So we want to start to create larger buckets that are made up of these more discrete tasks that are bottom up estimated, so that we have data that's actually useful coming out of this. And so that we can map this back to a schema that looks something like, client, project, maybe phase, and then task category. And these kind of tags here would map back to the task category. So we can still use bottom-up estimation on discrete tasks, but we have some mechanism to group those things back to broader buckets and start to build data models around it. All right.
Next question. So Carla had posted the question, why is that? And she asked it on the data structure slide. Carla, I don't know if you can provide a
come
little
on
bit
down,
more
Carla.
context.
This is a great question. Carla, would you like to come up and ask your question and just provide some context just to make sure that I answer that correctly?
Carla just dropped me a yes in the chat.
Can you make
because then I can unmute you.
Yeah.
Hi. No. She says no.
Okay. Do you want to provide some context in the chat? Want to make sure I get that question answered for you. I think it sounds like it was around why does precision not always equal accuracy, or why can precision actually be a negative thing and work against you getting good insight in the business? Is that what the question was about? Yes. Okay. So Carla, do you come from a project management background? Carla says, yes, that's the question. Do you come from a project management background? Yes, you do. All right. This is typical project management stuff. And I don't mean that and program manager, right? So as a project manager, your most important skill and one of the things that you're held accountable to is being very detail oriented and very precise. And so you become typically very conditioned in your career as a project manager to be very precise. But when you start having to apply this at a higher level, like operations and looking across the whole agency, precision can become your Achilles heel. Let me kind of talk you through a really practical example. I have a ton of project managers that have issues with how I measure cost per hour, because the way that I like to measure cost per hour is I take somebody's total salary, right? Which is, let's call it, $100,000 plus $20,000 in benefits per year is $120,000, divided by their total capacity. And for a normal person, that's 2,080 hours per year, 52 weeks per year, 40 hours per week. 52 by 40 is 2,080. And immediately the project managers in the room go, well, what about time off? And what about non-billable time? And what about holidays? And what about their utilization is changing from month to month? And what about overhead? Why isn't overhead in the cost per hour, right? So immediately people start freaking out about this. And my answer is, well, if you add all of that into the calculation for cost per hour, then you need all of those data points every time you use cost per hour in any report, whether it's looking at project profitability, scoping a project, et cetera. And the reality is that in this particular case, especially if we start adjusting cost per hour based on what somebody's utilization looks like, well, now we are actually worse off because we can't compare a project to another project if they're in different time periods with different utilizations, therefore different cost per hour for that same individual. We've now removed our ability to do horizontal analysis. And so the better choice to make there is to make this substantially less expensive as a metric to calculate by removing all of that complexity and simply modeling it in broader ways in the target. So if this gives us a number, let's do the math so I know exactly what this number is. So 120,000 divided by 2,080. This is $57 an hour, roughly. $57 per hour. And so if I'm scoping a project, then, and I'm using all of these like very gross margin kind of modeled cost per hour numbers, then I want to set my project gross margin target in the following way. If I have a goal of setting our net profit at 25%, and I know that overhead is about 25% of our AGI in a given year, and then I also know that my utilization and holidays and paid time off is going to take about 15%. So inefficiency is going to take about 15% off of my project margin when it hits the P&L. Well, now I can just kind of sum those things up. And I know that if I want to hit a 25% net, I'm spending 25% of my AGI on average on overhead, and I've got about a 15% loss of efficiency of my delivery team due to utilization and holidays. 15 plus 25 plus 25 means that 65% becomes the floor. So I can now start scoping projects, measuring project profitability using gross margin, and set the target at 65%. I'm still factoring in overhead, I'm still factoring in time off, I'm still factoring in utilization, but I don't have to carry that complexity around with me all the time. And I don't need to go get all of those data points every single time I want to use this metric. It's become substantially less complex. It's becoming substantially less expensive to build tooling and modeling and reporting around this. It's easier for everyone on the team to understand because the formula is simple. And I still get slightly less precise, but just as accurate, in my opinion, insight into if we're performing the way that we want to or not. So hopefully that's making sense. To me, it's like the difference between wearing your nicest suit every single day versus pulling it out when you actually need to wear it, like for your friend's wedding or for, this special event that you're going to. If we want to answer a more precise question, we can run that analysis. We can run analysis on how much overhead we're spending relative to AGI and what the inefficiency is when it's required to be more precise. But to me, having to factor all of that stuff into a simple metric like cost per hour all of the time is just insane and will not really scale well for a large organization. So this is probably my best example for how, and there's all kinds of places where this is also true, utilization rates and so on. Like the more complexity we can take out of a metric, generally the better, as long as we consider those things in broader terms. So I hope that answers your question, Carla, and gives you permission to not have to be so precise all the time, which again, like is something that we just get so conditioned to do when we come from a project management background because it's so important in that context. But again, can work against us when we get all the way up to the high level.
Wonderful. Carla just has one other thing. Have you spoken on CAC, which I'm going to assume is cost of acquisition?
Cost of acquisition. Yes, a very funny word for that. So customer acquisition costs, typically we're going to be measuring that under sales and marketing. So if you go back to the second session where I talked about our core financial metrics, I talk about sales and marketing spend there. And that is typically where you want to be measuring that. So that will either fall into, depending on how you're modeling it, pass-through expenses. That might be one place that some of your customer acquisition cost is modeled, and then the rest of it will likely fall into the sales and marketing category. So those things are considered in this context, assuming that all of this is relative to AGI, or agency gross income, which is the money that's left over after we've paid all of our pass-through expenses, which can sometimes include referral fees and so on, that actually belongs to us and is required for us to earn. And it's also factored here in overhead, where if we know that we are on average spending, 13% of our AGI on sales and marketing, so we're using those two levers to make sure that the customer acquisition cost is factored into this formula. There's some nuance, of course, depending on what your funnel looks like, but yeah, that should give you some clarity on how we make sure we're accounting for that in our modeling here. Great questions. I love the questions. We're going to have much more time for Q&A on the next session because I've got a really short presentation. So it'll be a lot of Q&A next time. So make sure you show up for that. Be here, be there, or be square, folks.
Awesome. Brandon just said, just want to give a quick shout out to you, Marcel. After the last session, we realized we were never accounting for overhead, which we calculated year to date in our pricing models.
Amazing, Brandon. Thank you for that. I'm really glad you got some insight. Appreciate all of you for showing up and having some great engagement in the chat, and just really warms my heart to see folks showing up and sharing wins that are already happening from these first few sessions, changing how you're pricing, talking to your accountants, starting to measure these things. That's all I want to see for all of you. So really, really grateful for all of you showing up and sharing your energy with me. And please go grab this free stuff. I was told the other day that we should be selling our toolkit for $1,000, and I would rather give it away for free.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marcel. Vish has just dropped 3 different links in here. So one to our academy, one to our community group where you can find all the recordings, and then also to the Parakeeto toolkit. So don't forget to fill out the survey. Thank you so much, Marcel. We will see you all next week for our last session. Very excited for it. Thank you all and have a wonderful day. Thanks, Marcel.